Hello, I'm Edward Ballison, Professor of History and Public Policy here at Duke University, and also Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Studies. And I'm joined for the second time by my friend and colleague.
Hi, I'm 𝐃𝐮𝐤𝐢𝐭. It's friend and colleague from the history department and the school of law.
um, Thavolia, it's so nice to be back with you for a second opportunity to think about the evolution of racism in American history. And in our first conversation, we talked about that really from the broadest possible perspective, thinking about a couple of hundred years of history from the founding of the American Republic, and of course, implicitly, really thinking about a couple hundred years before that, with the emergence of European settlement in the United States and the very early appearance of race-based slavery. I'd like in this conversation to think more about how that history has shaped the experience of people at this university. Duke, of course, only dates to 1924, when James B. Duke provided a founding gift of $40 million to launch the university. But its precursor, Trinity College, began much earlier, in 1838. And its first location was in Randolph County, North Carolina, before it moved to Durham. What was Trinity's relationship to the institution of slavery in those early years?
That's a very good question, Ed, and so a question that several people at Duke have been investigating and looking at in recent years. And so Trinity College is, first of all, I'd just like to say, we are Trinity College in some sense. I mean, it's our predecessor school. We have the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences that recognizes that deep tie to the past. What we have not been keen to recognize in that tie to Trinity is the possibility that we have some relationship to slavery through Trinity. Trinity, located in a county where slaveholding was not extensive. North Carolina was not a huge slaveholding state in comparison to South Carolina or Mississippi or Virginia. In Randolph County, slaveholding was small, but there were slaves on the campus of Trinity College, enslaved people who belonged to faculty members, who belonged to Braxton Craven in later years, in the last years. So Trinity College students would have come into intimate contact with enslaved people on campus and in the homes where they're boarded, where they're typically slaves used to help care for these students. And I think perhaps more critically, Trinity students would have come into knowledge of slavery through their classes. Braxton Craven, for example, gave many lectures on slavery. And his lectures were the typical lectures of a pro-slavery person and slaveholder in his case. I mean, he was a small slaveholder, but still one. So Trinity College is born in a county where slaveholding was small, both in terms of its overall size and in terms of its size within particular homes, but important to the functioning of the school and to the ideology that students were that shaped students' lives and shaped their thinking as they went out into the world to become farmers or teachers or whatever occupation they intended to follow.
I'm thinking here as well about the split in the Methodist Church in 1844 between a northern and southern version. Trinity College was a Methodist institution, and it went with the southern version.
It went with the Southern version, the pro-slavery version.
Yeah.
So there's that too. And so one of the things I think that Duke is wrestling with is how to embrace that part of Duke's history that's not, it's not Duke, right? Duke is not, does not have the same kind of story regarding slavery that other institutions like William and Mary or Emory or Harvard or Yale have. But its very existence in the South dictates that it has a history with slavery and with other problems that are sort of endemic to Southern life and society. And that's, Duke is in the South, and that means something. It means a lot of different things that Duke is now, I think, wrestling with in a lot of different ways, and probably the recent attacks and murders, killings rather, of Black men have put the focus everywhere on history. And we're no different in having to wrestle with that history. And I know that President Price has a number of programs that he's has tasked committees to look at that involve Duke's history and Trinity College as well.
So Trinity College did eventually move to Durham.
That's right.
In the late 19th century, amid that very moment that we were discussing in our last segment of reaction to the Reconstruction endeavor and the imposition of segregation across the South. How did that shape the early history of Trinity College in Durham?
You mean the moving at that particular moment? I don't think that it and one I don't think that it had much of an impact, but one would have to really do the research that I haven't done into that particular moment in Duke's history. It would seem, though, that as a matter of course, that to be in Durham in that decade meant to be witness to the disfranchisement of Black people, to be witness to the rise of Jim Crow, to be witness to the increasing attacks, physical, violent attacks on Black people, to be witness at the end of the century to the Wilmington Massacre. And so what would be interesting would be to look at the letters and communications of the board at that moment, to look at the lectures that professors gave at that moment, to see exactly how Trinity responded, how it saw itself. Did it seek to wall itself off from that? How did it train its students to go out into that particular world? And to my knowledge, we haven't done that research yet. And I say to my knowledge because there are so many people working on the history now that someone may have or be working on that, but I can't imagine Trinity, no less than Duke, could not be an island unto itself in Durham, a city, a town that's being transformed by the tobacco industry and what that means for race and the economy and Black people. So how it shaped out, I don't know, but I am pretty confident that Trinity College had to find a way to situate itself in that environment. And I suspect that it did it like most Southern schools at that time, Southern white schools, which would be to try to create a bubble for its students and kind of keep them away from the discord in the wider community and the wider world.
You noted that Trinity College and then Duke has always been rooted in the American South. In the 20th century, that meant that African Americans were always on campus, but only 1963. Only in 1963 does the first African American student gain admission to Duke. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that, the ways in which this Southern vocation, what that meant for the role of race at Duke, both before the civil rights movement and after.
So Duke and the history of Duke is intimately tied to the history of Durham and the history of Black people in Durham, who, as you note, even, well, throughout the time period, the long decades when Trinity and Duke were not integrated, African Americans were on this campus, right, in menial employment, doing the work of cleaning and cooking and gardening and so forth, the menial labor that institutions need someone to do to function. So the perception that the community had of Duke would have come through the lens of those people who worked at Duke. And from what we know, that wasn't always positive, it was sometimes positive, but Duke has always been a major employer of Black people. So it has become increasingly clear that the accounting that we're currently doing, the accounting for ourselves, for the institution, for the past, has to take into account the years when Duke refused to allow Black people, Black students to enter this university as students, of Black people to enter as students until 1963. So that's a very long time. So in that sense, Duke has joined or is part of the larger university, Southern University community that refuses to admit Black students, despite especially in the professional schools, despite an early Supreme Court decision that said that was unconstitutional. And so it's 1963, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a long time to be segregated. And
the change didn't just accelerate after that magically either.
no, it didn't. uh, I, and it's still, I don't know. I can't remember off the top of my head what the percentage of white students is today, but it's still not enough. So I guess in some, on that particular matter, Duke was, as we say, we both said, a Southern institution, and it did what white institutions did. It was established for white students in a world that was made for white people, in a world in which Black people existed to serve, and not to enjoy the same rights and privileges, including the right to a very good education. Mm-hmm.
Thevolia, do you have any concluding thoughts about the significance of this wider history for how we make sense of our current moment?
One thought, which is that I think that, and I'm hopeful that what Duke, like so many other institutions, what Duke is doing right now, like so many other institutions, is to begin, and we're just at the starting line, to begin to grapple with the history of the institution as a discriminating institution, as a segregated institution, and what it means to open the doors to people who are not white, not just African Americans, but people of Mexican descent, people who come from Cuba, or who come from Haiti, or who come from Africa, countries in Africa. We are still grappling with that, but I think it's also important to recognize that Duke, its mission, has to entail that sort of coming to terms, but at the same time, we are part of a larger world in which the problem exists on a larger scale. But if we do our part, then we send students out into the world who are capable of thinking about history and about the past and about race and slavery in a way that previous generations did not, and did not have to. And I think our students have to, because the world is not the world of 1963, when as a white student could leave here and not be worried about anything that had to do with people of color or African Americans or Native Americans, if that makes sense.
Well, Thevolia, thanks so much for this conversation, and
Thank you.
And look forward to chatting with you again soon.
We should do this more often.